both on the park side and the street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation online with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum and interact with our student-run Instagram at JFK Junior Forum for the behind-the-scenes highlights. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming IOP Director Mark Guerin.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We warmly welcome all of you here for a really engaging conversation this evening on the press, on the First Amendment, and covering the Trump White House. This has been a very busy season here at the Forum, and we invite you all back on Thursday, where we will have one of the IOP resident fellows, Deisha Dyer, in conversation with former Clinton and Obama Social Secretary and Chief of Protocol Capricia Marshall, moderated by Jackie O'Neill, the former Marshal here at Harvard, in a conversation about diplomacy, hospitality, the intersection of the important roles of a White House Social Secretary with diplomacy and foreign policy. But tonight we're fortunate to have Alice Stewart, who's our resident fellow this semester, in conversation with CNN's Jim Acosta. I'm here. Silence. Oh, good. Proof. Live streaming's not enough, apparently. Jim has just visited Alice's study group, engaged in conversation with students and members of the community here, and we're grateful to Alice for her joining us as resident fellow. She was, of course, Senator Ted Cruz's communications director during the presidential campaign, and Governor Huckabee as well, where then Governor Huckabee's daughter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, spent some time in the White House briefing room with a full circle here of opportunities. So,
all friends.
Mr. Acosta's bio is before you, so I will not rehearse it, certainly, but to observe that he is well known, I think, for his notable exchanges with members of the Trump administration, the Trump White House staff, and of course the president himself, as a candidate, as president-elect, and as president. As a candidate in May of 2016, then candidate Trump interrupted Mr. Acosta saying, excuse me, I've watched you on TV, you're a real beauty. Leading up then to the notable East Room press conference where President Trump said, you're a terrible person, you shouldn't be working for CNN, following an exchange with a White House intern that you can explain with a microphone, leading to the loss of his press credentials and Secret Service security clearances. CNN filed suit, and the judge reinstated his press credentials. So this is a backdrop of what Politico has dubbed him the chief antagonist to the Trump administration. But a topic that whatever one's politics, one might agree or disagree, and even within journalism, not all members of the press and those who covered the White House quite agree. In an Atlantic Monthly piece, Todd Purdom said Jim Acosta's dangerous brand of performance journalism. While speaking truth to power, he may be amplifying the president's anti-press campaign. So a spectrum of views, which is the hallmark of the JFK Junior Forum. And so with gratitude for your coming up to the forum and to Alice for moderating, I turn it to Alice Stewart. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for coming out. Jim, thank you for coming. It's been really great to have you talk about media and the role of the media in politics, and I appreciate everyone who has come out this evening and those watching online. It's a really great time and opportunity to speak about politics. There's no shortage of news, but the intersection of media and politics is really fascinating. And I want to start off, I do not want to bury the lead here. So the news of the day that everyone is talking about is the I word. And we're not talking about Infrastructure Week. We're talking about impeachment. And just to start off with that, What are your thoughts about how that has been rolled out and how you think that will play out?
Well, I think, there's a lot of twists and turns, I think, between now and when the House takes the vote. If they do decide to take a vote as to whether or not the president should be impeached, I do think that this is a very serious moment in the country's history. It does feel like it's been leading up to this. And that is why when I talk to people inside the president's team of advisors and aides, they will tell you that they feel like this is different. Jay Sekulow has said this is not a war, this is more of a skirmish. I think that that's spinning things a little bit. I have talked to folks inside the president's circle of advisors who have said that he's up against some very difficult circumstances at the moment. I think that whether you're Republican, Democrat, Trump supporter, never Trumper, whatever you want to call it, I do think that the facts at hand merit serious consideration, and they should give the American people great pause. When the President of the United States gets on a phone call with a foreign leader, and that foreign leader is talking about how he really wants to get his hands on some military assistance so he can fight the Russians, and then the president says, "Can you do us a favor, though?" And then mentions his grievances about the 2016 campaign, talks about Joe Biden and his son. I think that is a very serious matter, and I think that is why you're starting to see a shift in the polls right now. Back in May, only 41% of Americans were in favor of impeaching and removing the president from office. We had a poll out on CNN last night that said that had shifted to 47%. And so the American people are getting more in the mood to see some serious action taken against this president. I will tell you, Alice, I think a lot of this has been building up for some time. We saw this during the campaign, and we can talk about this, the way that the president went after immigrants, the way the president went after the press. He was shattering some norms in presidential politics that don't exactly make for deep wells of support, even in one's own party. That is why Senator Jeff Flake was recently quoted as saying if they took a secret vote inside the Senate to convict and remove the president from office, there might be 35 votes in the Senate among the Republican Party who would vote to convict and remove the president from office. Because the president has been a bit of a bull in a china shop from time to time, he's put himself in this situation. And so the president can rail against the press. He can say that the whistleblower is a spy, and that we should treat spies the way that we used to back in the old days, as he was caught on a hot mic the other day, or the way he's described Adam Schiff in just the last 24 hours, saying he should be arrested for treason. The president, he can blame all of these other forces, but to a large extent, he's put himself in this situation right now.
And it's been a very contentious time the last several months, several years, but if you can explain briefly your years in politics, covering politics in the news business, how would you characterize the atmosphere right now in politics or in the White House compared to what we saw, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of went up the old traditional route. I started off in a very sort of, low down on the totem pole job at a local station in Washington right out of college. I was answering the phones and making about $4.25 an hour, which is only slightly less than the minimum wage as it stands right now. And as a matter of fact, Sam Donaldson, who I get compared to from time to time, his wife worked at the station, and she would eventually, get a call from Sam from time to time, and he would call, and I would pick up the phone. He would, "This is Sam Donaldson. I would like to speak to my wife, please." Oh my goodness! And I would almost, hang up on Sam Donaldson. I was so worried that I would upset Sam Donaldson. But I went from there to a reporting job in Knoxville, Tennessee, to Dallas, Texas, then Chicago. Then I worked for CBS News, and then ultimately CNN. But along the way, I learned how to cultivate sources, break stories. I learned how to cover city hall, state government, eventually presidential campaigns. I've covered 4 presidential campaigns. So I feel like I've got a pretty, good sense of how to look at the country, I've been in just about every region of the country as a reporter. And, yes, things have gotten rough and tumble at times during the course of a presidential campaign. We saw the way John Kerry was treated in 2004. We saw the birther controversy and all the stuff that was thrown at Barack Obama. We saw some of the stuff that's been thrown at John McCain that was thrown at him over the years. I recounted in this off-the-record session that we had before coming out here how Mitt Romney was taken apart to some extent because of his faith, his Mormon faith. It's always been rough. It's always been nasty at times. The problem that we experience right now, and I think one of the reasons why I'm here with you tonight, is I feel like I've got a pretty unique experience in terms of what has been happening to the press in the United States over the last few years. We saw some of this happening during the course of the 2016 presidential campaign. Then candidate Trump would refer to the press as the disgusting news media, the dishonest news media. He called us liars, scum, and thieves. He would do this in front of thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands of people. Those folks would absorb that hostility, that rhetoric, and direct it back at us in ways that sometimes, quite frankly, made us feel threatened. People would come up to our press area, we called it the press cage, and shout traitor in our face and that sort of thing. And having covered 4 presidential campaigns, having covered city hall and state government in all parts of the country, I had never seen anything like that before. And it made me think, and I write about this in my book, it made me think that we're witnessing a new phenomenon in American politics. And what we saw during the early months of the Trump administration is he rolled that shtick going after the press into the Oval Office, started calling us fake news, and then ultimately the enemy of the people. And one of the messages that I try to get across to folks when I talk to people from time to time is, it's ultimately a question that we all have to answer. Is this the kind of politics that we want to have in this country? Is this the kind of political environment that we want to hand off to the next generation? Is anybody satisfied with the way things are right now? Because in my view, looking at things over the last 25 years I've been doing this, I think we're heading down a dark path. I think we're heading in a direction that ultimately we may regret if things get out of control.
About your book, here it is. It's a really great book. I encourage you to get it. The Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in America. What is the harm or the danger of anyone calling the media, who has the freedom of the press, what is the harm with calling them the enemy of the people or fake news? The damage that can potentially create.
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll give it a shot. When you refer to stories that you don't like as fake news, as the president does, obviously, some folks may be in on the act and understand he's just trolling us and he's just trying to get a rise out of people and push people's buttons for political gain and so on. The thing that I write about and what I try to explain to folks is that not everybody is in on the act. And one of the things that the president has done is he has escalated this rhetoric over time. And he went from calling us fake news, calling me fake news, to calling us the enemy of the people. And I provide some examples of why we should take this seriously, why this is more than just hostile rhetoric that jazzes people up on conservative media. For example, when Cesar Sayoc, the man who was convicted just recently of sending a pipe bomb to CNN and various Democratic officials around the country, when he was arrested and we went into his social media platforms, we found that he was threatening me. And he was saying, Acosta, you're the enemy. You're next. And one of the tweets that he directed at me to threaten me, there was an image attached to it of a decapitated goat's head. And I'm not alone. I'm hardly alone in this regard. Many of my colleagues, in the press, reporters, anchors, folks at CNN, folks at other networks, they've all experienced the same kind of hostility, the same kind of rhetoric, and we've just gotten to a point where it's out of control. And the reason why it's dangerous is because the President of the United States is in a unique position. He commands a huge social media audience of tens of millions of people. And while they may get their jollies from coming after us from time to time, and it jazzes up their base and fires up their base, the problem that I think they encounter and that we're all encountering right now is that not everybody is in on the act. And there are some folks out there who, as we all know, aren't exactly playing with a full deck. and they absorb that kind of rhetoric, and they think it's something that's actionable. Remember what happened in the El Paso mass shooting that happened just a short time ago. The El Paso mass shooting, the manifesto that was written by that gunman talked about immigrants as being part of an invasion. What did President Trump do during the course of the midterm campaign cycle last year? He was referring to immigrants, that caravan of migrants heading towards our border, as being part of an invasion. As a matter of fact, Alice, not to belabor this point too long, but during that press conference that resulted in my press pass being away, that was the question that I was trying to ask the president. And as you see, and I put this in my book, there's a transcript in there of our exchange, and the reason why I put that in there is not to bore the reader, but so the reader can see in the first 5 or 6 words coming out of my mouth, the president is interrupting me, he's berating me, he's insulting our news organization, and all I'm trying to do is ask, weren't you essentially lying to the American people when you described that caravan of migrants as being part of an invasion? There was no invasion. These were migrants coming towards our border, but they weren't part of an invasion. So we are seeing a pattern. And now that we're about 2 or 3 years in, there's an established factual pattern of rhetoric and behavior that follows that is very regrettable, violent, and potentially very, very deadly. And not just potentially deadly, has been very, very deadly. And I think it all leads me to a point where I think, folks, we need to hit the pause button and think deeply about whether or not this is appropriate coming from the President of the United States, and whether we want this to be a part of our political culture in this country. After the President of the United States calls you the enemy of the people, what does he do for an encore? What comes after that? After he's finished calling the press the enemy of the people, which segment of American society comes after that? Is it academia? Is it law enforcement? We've seen the president demonize law enforcement during the course of the Mueller investigation. He's now referring to Adam Schiff as essentially a traitor. There are limits to what a society can withstand in terms of absorbing this rhetoric, if you don't want to see things ending badly. And I think we're already starting to see things end badly as a result of some of this rhetoric. And I don't think we want to see things play out the way they're playing out right now. I think it leads to a bad place.
When we talk about fake news and enemy of the people and the president's criticism of the media and the media coverage, playing devil's advocate here, one might say there are often times when there is good news from the administration, whether we're talking about the economy or work on the First Step Act or opioid crisis. There are positive results from this administration that oftentimes don't get covered, as opposed to coverage of some of these other more salacious stories. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think it's a fair point. I think it's a valid point, and I get this question from time to time. People say, why don't you report the good things that President Trump has done? And I will say, well, didn't you see our report on the stock market last week, or on the jobs numbers? We have been reporting on some of the economic gains in this country. I do think you have to have some perspective and offer some context and say that the economy was on an upward trajectory as Donald Trump became president of the United States. You can't leave that out just because you don't want them to be mad at you. We certainly can't do that. But I do think, setting that to the side for a moment, one of the things that I think the president gets in trouble with is that he is at times his own worst enemy, if you'll pardon the expression. Take, for example, what happened last week at the United Nations General Assembly. This is supposed to be a time when the president is interacting with world leaders and talking about how to solve the crisis in the Korean Peninsula and how to deal with Iran and so on. And the whole week we're talking about Ukraine. Now, that is not the media doing that. That is the President of the United States being called onto the carpet for being involved in a questionable conversation with a foreign leader in which a favor was sought. And so, yes, we're obviously going to cover that. That's the news. And, he was complaining during that press conference that we weren't covering all the good things that he was doing at the United Nations. Well, that's right, Mr. President. That's because there was some other big news going on that week, and that is this very questionable conversation that is now resulting in an impeachment inquiry, and who knows what's next. At the very beginning, it was funny because you said, Alice, I'd like to start off talking about the I word, and you said Infrastructure Week. How many times, for some of the folks who are astute and cover the news and binge watch CNN, thank you so much for doing that, Let me give you a round of applause for that. No, how many times have we talked about Infrastructure Week? There have been more Infrastructure Weeks than just about anything else during this administration. And it's almost a joke inside the White House press corps. Every time Infrastructure Week is declared, we say, "Oh my goodness, hold on to your hats, buckle your seatbelts, something's about to unfold." As a matter of fact, at Trump Tower in August of 2017, when I had that back and forth with the president about Charlottesville, and he uttered that phrase, "There were very fine people on both sides," that press conference that day was supposed to be about infrastructure. Elaine Chao, the transportation secretary, had come down, Mick Mulvaney, who was at the Office of Management and Budget at that point, and they were going to come out there and roll in there and talk about infrastructure and what they wanted to do to help the nation's infrastructure. And we were told, and I put this in my book, just before he got going, aides to the president were saying, he's not going to take any questions today, Jim, so don't try to ask any questions. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to ask any questions. And one of my colleagues asked a question about Charlottesville, and we were off to the races, and that's what unfolded after that. We got into this very lengthy back and forth with the president about Charlottesville. So at times, he is his own worst enemy. He steps on his message all the time, to the chagrin of people inside the White House who tell us all the time it's endlessly frustrating for them.
Well, since you brought it up about you asking questions, the exchange Mark mentioned about there was a Q&A with the president, and an intern was holding the microphone, and there was a little back and forth with regard to you deciding when you were done and the White House deciding when you were done, and there was a scuffle with the microphone. If we can briefly explain.
Recount that.
You got in trouble, you got put on timeout, and explain what happened then in the
a little more than timeout. It is still one of the more surreal. It's probably the most surreal 1984 Orwellian thing that's happened to me in the course of my career. But we walked into that press conference that day. The president and the Republican Party just lost control of the House in the midterms. That was going to go to the Democratic Party. And one of the questions I wanted to ask, as I was just saying a few moments ago, was about his false claim, this lie that this caravan of migrants heading towards the border amounted to an invasion. We get into this heated exchange. He calls me the enemy of the people, and during the course of all of that, an intern comes out of nowhere and is trying to take the microphone from me, and I'm thinking to myself, hold on a second, what's going on here? This has never happened to me before, and as you can see in the video, I kind of pull back like this and say, "Pardon me, ma'am." And fortunately, my friend Peter Alexander with NBC stood up for me and said, "Jim's a great guy," or he said something along those lines. Maybe it wasn't that good, but he said, "Jim busts his tail," or something like that, I think is what he said. I went about my business the rest of the day, did my story for CNN that evening, and then left to go get dinner, and then came back. And on my way back to the White House, I looked down at my phone, and there's this message on the screen. It says that my press pass had been taken away. It's a message from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and I'm thinking to myself, oh boy, this is not good. It wasn't a message to me, it was to the entire world. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this could be problematic. And then the Secret Service, I see this head stick outside of the side of the Secret Service booth that you go through to go to the White House. This head pokes out, and I said, okay, that's the Secret Service guy. And the Secret Service guy is saying, oh, that's him, that's Jim. And he came over and took my press pass, and the only thing I could think of at that moment was to pull my phone out and make sure I recorded what happened, because I didn't know what was going on. Am I going to be arrested? What's going to happen here? And I wanted to make sure everything was documented so they couldn't say that I had done something untoward. And they took away my press pass. Sarah Sanders tweets out that we can't tolerate a reporter laying his hands on an intern. Remember that one?
Right.
And that was a lie, and I tweeted as much. And then later, and after that all reverberated through social media, and Sarah was getting a lot of backlash as a result of that, she decided, and the White House decided, the United States government decided, paid for with your tax dollars, decided to tweet out a video that was altered. It was apparently borrowed from InfoWars or somebody associated with InfoWars. And I'm no expert at this, but it was sped up and the audio was muted, so you couldn't hear me say, "Pardon me, ma'am." And it made it look as if I was karate chopping the intern. Remember the karate chop? And I'm just thinking to myself, it was almost an out-of-body experience, because I'm thinking to myself, is this me that they're showing in this video here? What is going on here? This is, I must have been transported to a parallel universe where nothing makes sense anymore, even more so than before. And, I realized at that moment that my career was in jeopardy, that my job was at stake, that something very important was going on, that the White House was willing to alter reality in order to punish a reporter who had upset the president. And the question that I ask, and I write about this in my book, is whether or not any of that is tolerable. And whether you like me or don't like me, if I'm not your favorite cup of tea, I understand, that's fine. But put any other reporter in that situation, is that anything we want to tolerate in this country? On multiple levels, not just the press pass getting taken away from a reporter, that's one thing, but also just the notion that the White House, the United States government, would be in the business of altering reality in order to get something to occur that they would like to see to occur. And fortunately, CNN did not hesitate. Even our parent company just came into the picture. AT&T did not hesitate. We decided to take the administration to court. And not to belabor this, but I will tell you that people don't remember this, but during the court case that was argued out in federal court in front of a Trump-appointed judge by Justice Department lawyers paid for with your tax dollars, they made the argument in federal court that the Trump administration, the White House, can pick and choose who covers the president. That if they don't like the story that you're doing, if they don't like the coverage that you're providing, they can go up, tap you on the shoulder, and say, hey, buddy, you're out of here. And I think that it's not a stretch to describe what was just a sort of press pass case, a case about, oh, will Jim get his press pass back, that all of this mushroomed and escalated to a First Amendment challenge in this country. It is not a stretch to say that if the administration had been successful, that there would have been a real chilling effect on the press in this country, on the First Amendment in this country. Mayors, governors, and other parts of the country could go up to news outlets they don't like and throw people out because of the coverage that they're providing. Other governments around the world could say, well, we're going to do this because look what they're doing in the United States. And I think you would have seen a real chilling effect on our profession. The one thing I will say is, and I express this to my friends in conservative media from time to time, there is no constitutional guarantee, if you've looked at the Constitution, that you guys get to stay in power forever. So if the shoe's on the other foot, do you want a Warren administration, a Kamala Harris administration, a Bernie Sanders administration to come along to Fox News or conservative outlets and say, now you guys are out of here. We're going to do to you what they did to CNN. We can't have a situation like that in this country.
And the value of the free press is so important. I've got one more question for Jim, and then if you guys want to start making your way to the microphones, we'll spend the rest of the time here taking your questions, and Jim will answer them to the best of his ability.
I'll do my best.
But so many things stood out in this book. One of the things that you write about as kind of introspective, looking into the presidency, and I think a lot of people ask this question. I know as a conservative, running against, when Ted Cruz was running against the president, and then when he won the nomination, you would look at some of the things he says and some of the things he does and supporting him politically. You think how it will change when he gets into the White House. And you raise an interesting point in the book. You question, would he change the office or would the office change him? What do you think has happened?
I mean, I remember when Donald Trump was being sworn into office, there was all this commentary about whether or not he would change. Remember, this was a candidate who launched his campaign describing Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals. This is a candidate who, during the tail end of 2015, called for a ban on all Muslims coming into the United States, who attacked the press in ways that we had never seen a presidential candidate do before in my lifetime, and I'm getting up there. And so I did not think that the office was going to change the man. I did not think that the majesty and all the trappings of the presidency would rest upon his shoulder and transform him into the second coming of Ronald Reagan. I just didn't see that happening. This was a candidate during the course of the campaign who alleged that Ted Cruz's father was somehow part of the Kennedy assassination. People don't remember this one. He called into question the labor unemployment statistics and said that the jobless rate was actually many times more than where it was during the tail end of the Obama administration. There were multiple falsehoods that we were trying to clarify the record on a daily basis. And I just never thought that this candidate who ran this way, won the presidency this way, would govern any differently. Why would he? It worked for him during the campaign. Obviously, they felt it was going to work for him during the administration. But I never thought we would get to a point where an incoming president of the United States, and this happened at that press conference in January 2017, would refer to the press as fake news. And remember what happened at that press conference. Remember what was going on at that time. The U.S. intelligence community had gone to the president-elect and said, Mr. President-elect, the Russians may have compromising information on you. This could be a problem for your presidency. He described that story as fake news. This is a story that CNN had first, and it was not fake news. It was a thing that actually happened in the real world. You can't call something like that fake news if it's something that actually happened. And the question that led to the confrontation that he and I had at that press conference was very simple. It was, did your aides or associates have contacts with the Russians during the campaign? And what happened during the course of that campaign? His eldest son met with a Russian attorney at Trump Tower, presenting herself as somebody who was working on behalf of the Kremlin. And so it was a legitimate question at the time about a legitimate story at the time. And so, none of that was telling me at the time that he was going to govern any other way. This was somebody who relentlessly attacked the press during the campaign, and I expected it during his presidency. I never thought I would hear the words enemy of the people. That, I think, is something that, it's one of the reasons why I was comfortable with that being the title of my book. I think that phrase will help come to define this era, an era in which one group of Americans was pitted against another group of Americans, where the President of the United States felt it was acceptable to demonize other Americans in order to achieve political objectives. And the question for all of us as we head into this upcoming campaign is to decide for ourselves whether or not that is the America you want to be a part of here on out. Because now that we've reached this point, I think it stands to reason that things could escalate and get much worse.
Right. And for the record, I did ask Rafael Cruz if he was involved in the assassination of JFK, and he said no.
Oh, that's good.
So
I'm glad we have that settled. That's good.
Okay,
There's so many other conspiracy theories that we need to work through, though.
All right, we'll start with some questions.
Yeah.
You up there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Dimas. I'm an MPP student here at the Kennedy School. My question is about the I word and the role of the media. As you said that according to the CNN, less than half of American people are now in favor of the I word. And that is after a pretty much solid case that the mainstream media tries to give that there is indeed a quid pro quo in the phone call with President Zelensky, and that is after years of Russian collusion coverage, of Mueller report coverage. My question is, what does it say to you about the level of trust the American people have towards the media if after these years of incessant coverage, the meter doesn't really move? And
well, I don't know if that's necessarily true, if I may. If you look at the polling that just came out yesterday, yes, CNN poll found that 47% of Americans now believe that the president should be impeached and removed from office, but that jumped from 41% just last May. There have been similar polls that have just come out in the last couple of days that have shown a spike in that feeling. And so I would disagree with the premise of your question. I think what you're trying to say is that because we've been blanketing the airways with this story, that things haven't changed very much. First of all, we haven't been blanketing the airways with this story intentionally to cause anything to happen. We're just doing the news. We have been covering other stories as all of this has been going on. But at the same time, I think there has been a measurable difference in the public's attitude about this. I think there's no question about it. And really, I mean, polling, is that what drives our decision making? Should it drive our decision making? Should it drive the decision making behind this impeachment process? I suppose that sounds awfully Pollyannish for a chief White House correspondent coming from Washington, but I think our representatives in government are going to have to make this determination as the facts are laid before the American people. I don't think we've seen all the facts up until this point. Keep in mind what we just saw yesterday evening at about 4 or 5 o'clock yesterday evening. We found out that the president had been talking to the Prime Minister of Australia about this, that the Attorney General was going to different parts of the world and talking to other heads of state about this. And in terms of the public's attitude about the press, I mean, if the President of the United States were spending just about every day going after veterinarians, I have a feeling that a lot of people would be taking care of their doggies and their kitties on their own and not taking them to the veterinarian. If the President of the United States were going after dentists the way he goes after journalists on a daily basis, people might be pulling out their own teeth at home. They might not trust their dentist as much as perhaps they used to in the past. And that was one of the questions that I asked the President in February of 2017, that this constant demonization of the press, isn't that going to have an effect on the public's attitude about the mainstream media in this country? He didn't want to really take that question. You can go and look at the transcripts to see whether or not he answered that question in a straightforward way, but he basically dodged the question at that time. I think there's no doubt when the President of the United States attacks the press in a sustained way, refers to members of the news media as the enemy of the people, there obviously is going to be a cause and effect, and you're going to see large portions of the American people, particularly on the Republican side, who are not going to have faith in the press anymore. But I think to lay that at the feet of the news media and the professionals who work in this business, I think is just an overly simplistic view, if you don't mind me saying, sir.
Thank you. All right, down here.
Hi, my name is Chase. I'm a first year at the college. You kind of touched on this in your answer to the previous question, but would you say that Trump is kind of the cause of this notion of the enemy of the people? You've brought that term up a lot. He uses it a lot as well. But do you
Well, it was
think
a term that Stalin used.
Well, yeah.
Dictators have used in the past, yeah.
Do you think that kind of this notion in the United States specifically is kind of coming from him, or is he just exploiting a feeling that had already existed? And if that's the case, where do you think it comes from?
Well, I think to some extent, some of this can be measured during the Obama presidency, the election of the first African American president. I covered the Tea Party rallies, which were described to the public as being fiscally minded, about deficits, about the bailouts, and so on. And I covered those rallies, and I saw a lot of racist imagery about the President of the United States. I write about this in my book. I do think, to some extent, Donald Trump, as a figure who had toyed with the idea of running for president, seized on some of those feelings. He obviously trafficked in the birther conspiracy, which was a total lie. And so, I do think that to some extent, he exploited some feelings that were already there, that were sort of ripe for the picking. But one of the reasons that I've found that the president, dislikes the press so much is that we're calling out his falsehoods. This is a president of the United States, as I write in my book. When this book was published in June of this year, according to the Washington Post, had uttered 10,000 false or misleading statements since coming into office. Just the other day, the Washington Post reported it's now at 12,000. So just since the publication of my book in June, it's jumped from 10,000 to 12,000. Now, I suppose there are folks on who are in the president's camp who will say that you can't believe fact checkers anymore either. You can't believe the news anymore. You can't believe fact checkers anymore. He talks about how you can't believe polls anymore. What's next? You can't believe election results anymore. And so to some extent, the press, members of the press, yes. Does it concern us that we're talked about in this fashion? Yes, absolutely. I've had, by my count, about a death threat a week since Donald Trump came into office. That wasn't going on before he became president. But what do we do? I describe it throughout my book as a question of what do you do? Do you stand there and take it? Do you sit there like a potted plant and just absorb the abuse? Or do you stand up for yourselves and stand up for the important questions that need to be asked on behalf of the American people? I don't just think about the people on the right who are trolling me on social media as if that is going to send me into the fetal position, crying myself to sleep at night every night. I also think about people who are in the middle of the political spectrum, independents, people on the left. They deserve their questions answered just as much as anybody else. And so we have to remember when we're working in the news business, we're not just here to do the news for the Republicans. We're not just here to do commercials for the president. We're not here to do commercials for the president. We're here to do the news for all Americans. And that means sometimes asking the questions that they don't want to answer, even if it means they might take your press pass away.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned some of the people at the president's rally. One might say that the president's frustration a lot with the media reporting and the media coverage is that, A, they do underestimate the enthusiasm at his rallies, and B, they do tend to characterize a lot of his supporters as the way you described them, as opposed to hardworking middle American people. And his enthusiasm for his support and the energy behind him doesn't get reported as it should. I
think that's a valid point, and I will say, and I talk about this. As much as Steve Bannon likes to call us the media elite, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I mean, I grew up in a blue-collar home. My parents split up when I was 5 years old. My mother, she worked in restaurants her whole life. My dad worked in supermarkets his whole life. And my parents were divorced, when I was just a kid, and so I was raised by a single mother. I'm hardly a part of the media elite. I was not a part of the elite in the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I grew up. All of my friends were, a lot of my friends were, but I wasn't a part of that. I think I relate pretty well to Trump supporters because I think I understand where they're coming from. Yes, many of them are blue collar, as I talk about in my book, and I tell folks from time to time. A lot of them look like Democrats to me when I go to the president's rallies. A lot of them are disaffected Bernie Sanders supporters. A lot of folks from the labor movement who have given up on the Democratic Party and are, they're certainly drawn to what Trump is talking about, especially in terms of the trade issue. I don't think it's fair to describe the way I describe Trump supporters as I'm just painting them all as racist. That's not the case at all. I think the vast majority of Trump supporters are fine people, and I talk to them all the time. A lot of them come up to me at these rallies and say, you know what, Jim, we're really sorry that he talked to you guys that way and talked about you guys that way. And it says to me that a lot of them know that what they're witnessing is an act. The problem is, Alice, is that not everybody is in on the act, and that is why it is possible that people can absorb that kind of rhetoric, absorb that kind of hostility, and direct it back at us in ways that make us feel threatened, send death threats, not just to me, but my colleagues. That is the problem that we're up against. And so, yes, I do think to some extent there's a valid criticism that perhaps all Trump supporters are described in a certain way or painted in a certain way. But we also have to understand we need to take ownership of what's being said at some of these rallies. I'm not the one holding up the cue cards saying build the wall or lock her up or CNN sucks. Those are things that people who go to these rallies are saying willingly. And the question that we have to ask ourselves as we go into this next election and into this next decade is whether or not it's appropriate to talk about our fellow Americans in that fashion, whether or not it's appropriate to treat our fellow Americans in that fashion. And I think one of the lessons that will be learned after this era is behind us, and I do think that time will come, I think people will look back with a measure of regret. I think people will look at the archival footage and see some of the things that are said at these rallies and see some of the ways that the press is treated, that immigrants are treated in this country. And I think that there will be a regret. And I don't say that to belittle anybody or to put anybody down or to hold myself as being superior to somebody else. I'm just saying the fact of the matter is there are things that are being said and there are things that are done in the name of this president, in support of this president, that is regrettable. And I do think that it is a tough thing to say, and it's a tough thing to absorb, and it's a tough thing to hear. But if we're going to have an honest conversation about these sorts of things, we have to come to grips with that reality.
Thank you. Yes, up there.
Hi, my name is Miyu Kumakura. I'm a junior at the college. This question relates slightly to the answer you gave to the former question. But we've talked out the night about how the current president has redefined.
This is what we used to do in the briefing room, by the way. You know, when we used to have briefings and, we would ask questions and the press secretary would dodge. The next person would try to pick up and ask that same question. But anyway.
But we've talked about.
You guys remember what briefings are, right? Okay.
How the president has redefined the press as enemies of the people, as journalists as so. I'm curious to know, how has your own definition of being a journalist developed and changed throughout the course of his presidency?
Yeah.
In essence, if he defines you as an enemy of the person, how would you respond with your own definition?
Well, I am not the enemy of the people. We are not the enemy of the people. I am not your enemy. You are not my enemy. It is wrong to call your fellow American the enemy of the people. We are all on the same team. We are all Americans. And when it comes to calling people the enemy, I don't think you can put it any more plainly than that. That's not taking a position on a political issue. I'm not telling you what should be done about climate change or healthcare or North Korea or Syria. I'm telling you what I think, and I think it's a pretty I think it's a pretty earnestly held position on my part that this is not the road we should go down. Now, in terms of my philosophy as a journalist and the way I approach this story, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My dad is a Cuban immigrant. He came to this country in 1962, 3 weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis. He is a Cuban refugee. And, you know, his Cuban heritage is my Cuban heritage. I'm proud of it. It's always been a subject of fascination for me because of what goes on in Cuba. In Cuba, they don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of the press. You can't have forums like this and have a reporter stand up here or sit up here and talk about the Castros in the way that I'm talking about our president and calling into question what he does. It's not allowed there. But I will tell you, one of the highlights of my career was when I was able to go back to Cuba in March of 2016. I had an opportunity to cover Barack Obama's visit to the island. They were reestablishing relations with the Cuban government, and I had a chance to ask Raul Castro a question about his human rights record. And I asked him, why do you have political prisoners in your country, and will you let them go? And I remember at the time, Raul Castro was taking the headphones off of it. He couldn't, you know, they have these translator headphones on where they listen to the translation. He was pulling them off. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A Cuban reporter can't get away with something like that, but a Cuban American can. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. I don't think we should lose sight of what we have in this country, the ability to call the President of the United States out for what he does and what he says. It is precious. It is baked into our Constitution. And, you know, I will confess, and I'm not trying to play to the audience here, I am a little bit of a Kennedy nut and like to read about President Kennedy. One of the things that he talked about this in a speech in 1961, talked about the role of the press. That the role of the press is not just to chase, you know, the headlines that will drive sales of newspapers. It's not to tell the public what they want to hear. It's telling the public what they need to hear. And in some cases, to anger public opinion. Now, if John F. Kennedy can be in favor of the press mixing things up from time to time and, you know, getting the public a little fired up about what's happening in the country, then I think we can do that in this era too, and perhaps we need that now more than ever.
I think one thing you've said is hate is the enemy of the people, not the media.
I do.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that we have to come to grips with as a country is whether or not we can continue down this path. And you know, I told a couple of stories earlier during the off the record session. I'll share them with all of you who weren't there. You know, one of the reasons why I like to go to these Trump rallies is because I feel like that's the best way to figure out what's happening in this country, what's happening to this country. And there was a Trump supporter who came up to me in Columbia, South Carolina last year, and he said, you know, my mother needs to sit down. Can I borrow a chair? And I gave him my chair, and he came back after the rally was over and said, thanks very much. Your mother raised you right. And I said, well, she tried to. And he said, you know, it's interesting. I thought it was interesting how you were saying the Pledge of Allegiance and you were singing the national anthem. And I thought to myself, well, of course, I'm an American. To some extent, what we've seen over the last few years is a tendency on the part of the president and some of his supporters to not just dehumanize folks in the press, but de-Americanize them. To portray reporters and members of the press in such a way that people might find it surprising that you would know the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America. And so, you know, at that moment I had a connection with that Trump supporter. We sort of, you know, jammed the radars at the Fox News headquarters, who sometimes, you know, lead people to think that, you know, we're all bad people. At that moment, I think I really connected with him, and I think he understood that we're there just to do a job, and that is why we're here. We're here to report the news.
It's a great story. Question here.
Hi.
Yeah.
My name is Ben Bolger, and some political theorists have argued that education is one of the most important things to democracy, more important than even access to health care, which is also very important. In today's age where the president regularly lies about basic scientific issues and other things that are settled evidence.
Drawing on a map kind of thing, or
should we, in grade school or in high school, have a more rigorous curriculum that includes like critical media studies? So I think as adults, we might be able to perhaps be more critical. Some of us not. But younger people are growing up in an age where the president is making simply untruthful statements. Right. And it's a very, I think, awkward time for young people to be growing up.
Well, I think that there are a couple of things. One is, people are absorbing a lot of false, factually inaccurate information, and it's almost a fire hose of falsehoods these days. That is doing some damage. I do think that the other thing that concerns me when I go to these rallies is how young people are responding to all of this. Young people are chanting along with some of these chants. And, that is our future. Our future is being defined by some of this to some extent. I do think that, yes, I think we need to do a better job of educating kids at an early age. I think for the most part, we have to become more sophisticated consumers of information. We need to make sure we're getting our news from all sorts of places. I always put a plug in for The Economist. That is one of those places. Perhaps folks think it's a little right-leaning, but it covers the whole globe. It gives you everything that's happening under the sun. I think that we have to have a well-rounded diet of information. The other thing that we have to be careful about is, we really have to get away from this Uncle Fred sent me a link on Facebook, www.hillaryisamonster.com, and that sort of thing. Like, that may not be the best source of information, if you're getting that on your Facebook. I think social media companies have a responsibility. One of the things that I've dealt with since Trump has come into office is, social media platforms have become sort of a new frontier for people to harass and bully the press. I've gotten a litany of death threats in my social media accounts. You should be decapitated. You should be set on fire. I hope you get cancer. All sorts of things. And you'll report this stuff to Instagram, and it'll say, well, this doesn't violate our social media guidelines or whatever. And it's kind of stunning. It's kind of incredible. And I guess some of that falls under the First Amendment. But I think one of the messages I try to get across to the earlier group, because there was a lot of younger folks in there, we need to be thinking about how we're treating each other, not just in the public sphere, but on places like social media too. You may think, oh, no harm is being done here when I bully somebody on social media. A tremendous amount of harm could be done. You could be pushing somebody into harming themselves and that sort of thing. We've got to get a grip on how we're treating each other, and I think that's really at the heart of a lot of this. And I think that's why a lot of this I draw back to the president. If the president of the United States feels that it's okay to call the press the enemy of the people, call us all sorts of names, say that Adam Schiff should be tried for treason, describes the chairman of the Fed as the enemy, as he did the other day, and so on. We've degraded our public discourse to a point where anything goes, and we just can't have a situation like that, in my view. And I think that it's perfectly fine for a reporter who is doing the news on a regular basis to say that, because, I think after 25 years of doing this and covering just about every politician of all stripes under the sun, what we're witnessing right now is very unusual. And I think that we have to hit the pause button and think deeply about whether or not this is the kind of environment we want to hand off to the next generation.
All right, we've got time for a couple more questions, and then we will wrap it up, and Jim will head to the airport. Up there in the green shirt.
Hey there, Mr. Acosta. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
I
you.
just wanted to say I really inspire your grit, and I think you are a terrific fighter. My name's Justin Lopez.
Appreciate it.
I'm from Miami, Florida.
You're done. Now let's go to the next guy. No, I'm just kidding. I've been so heavy. I feel like you guys don't know how funny I am and how, quick-witted I am. You're missing all of that. It's been so heavy.
So I'm not going to try to defend everything the president says. I don't think that it's worth defending everything. But one thing in particular that you brought up before was the Charlottesville press conference. And then you described it kind of as President Trump saying that there were very fine people on both sides in regards to white supremacists and neo-Nazis.
Right.
Yet in that same thought, it's around 3 paragraphs, he says specifically, they were very fine people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and white supremacists. They should be totally condemned.
Right.
He's talking about people that are in favor of removing the statues and in favor of keeping them.
That is an excellent question, and we could expand that and cover it over the course of a whole hour. One of the things that it's a good thing that you brought this up, because one of the things that the president's defenders will say is that is the Charlottesville hoax. They will say the reason why the press is doing this to beat up on the president, and they're doing it unfairly. Keep in mind, when the president first came out and gave his statement on what happened in Charlottesville, he talked about there being blame on many sides. And then he paused and said, many sides. That was his first reaction to what happened in Charlottesville. And then a couple of days later, we were told, oh, the president's going to, he's going to change course. Because remember, Paul Ryan came out of the woodwork. All these Republicans came out of the woodwork and said, Mr. President, that is not acceptable what you said about Charlottesville on the day that it happened. So the president came out 2 days later and made another statement. I was in the press pool that day and was with the president and had a chance to ask him a question about it. He came out and he condemned, on that day, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, said that has no place in this country. Everybody said, okay, there we go, we're out of here. And then I asked the president, well, why didn't you do this the first time? And he called me fake news. Put all that to the side. The next day, he was going to have a press event in Trump Tower in New York. And we thought, well, we don't know where this story is going to lead. We should follow him up there. And we went to that press conference. And it was during that press conference where he was really all over the map on this subject. And if you want to go back and look at the tape, I was the one who asked him the question, and I didn't really put it in the form of a question, where he went on to say there were very fine people on both sides. It was at that moment I said to him, before he said that, I said, Mr. President, it's the Nazis who started this in Charlottesville. And that is when he proceeded to say that there were very fine people on both sides. Now, he did go on to say that what he said afterwards about white supremacists and neo-Nazis. But keep in mind, think deeply about what happened in Charlottesville. Think deeply about who was protesting on the side of the Unite the Right, alt-right protesters. These were neo-Nazis. These were white supremacists. These were KKK members. And I do think it is a reasonable question to ask. If you're just a MAGA supporting President Trump, fan, what are you doing marching in a protest with a bunch of people from the KKK who are white supremacists and Nazis? I'm sorry, and I write about this in the book. In my view, in this circumstance, there aren't two sides to a story when it's a matter of right versus wrong. If you are marching with Nazis and white supremacists and KKK members, I don't care if you want to put up a statue to Vince Lombardi or Tom Brady, to localize the analogy. I think you need to think deeply about what you're doing with your life if you're marching with those kinds of folks. And if you look at what the president said during that press conference, he was once again kind of all over the place and not really laying down a well-defined marker in terms of where he stood. And as it turns out, later on, a couple of months later, he went on to continue to blame people on both sides. And so we never really got a straight answer from him in terms of where he stood on all of that. But I do think when you say that there are very fine people on both sides, I think legitimate questions can be raised as to what you're talking about. Because on one of those sides, there were bad people, man. Those are bad people.
All right, we got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up here. We'll go to right here. And you've got 5 seconds for the question and 10 seconds for the answer.
Okay. How you doing? My name is Jeff. I'm a mid-career.
Yes.
So
thanks for coming. Thanks everybody for coming, by the way, in case they race me out of here.
I have an 84-year-old aunt who grew up in Alabama. And she said 3-4 years ago she started to feel like she hadn't felt the level of angst, visceral angst in the country since Jim Crow, Alabama, right? And so yesterday or the day before, the president tweeted or retweeted Civil War. This is something that has been muttered about, but as a person from a community that historically has not had the luxury of taking sentiments or threats like that lightly, are you as terrified as vulnerable communities in America are? And to what degree and extent does the media have a role in ensuring that we are off this trajectory that a lot of people say, oh no, that will never happen. But again, Reconstruction, I mean, you look at our history, it can happen like that. And if there was ever a moment in our history where we've been this close, I don't know. I mean, for that to come from the president, right, is again, from my community, is terrifying.
Right. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, I'm very concerned about it. I will tell you, at a rally that I covered last year, a woman came up to me and said, if you keep asking the questions that you're asking, it's going to lead to a civil war. And so, to some extent, there are folks who have become so emotionally invested in what's happening right now and in the president that they can imagine these sorts of possibilities. And one of the things that has to be said is that not all Republicans feel this way, by the way. Alice Stewart, is here. There are a lot of folks in the Republican Party who also take issue with this kind of rhetoric and believe that it's not appropriate. Having said that, I take very seriously what the president tweeted when he said that. I think, as we found with his expression, the enemy of the people, we've gone back to him and said, and to his team, and said, and so have other publications, the New York Times, the executive editor of the New York Times went to the president and also took issue with this. And he's disregarded it, and he's continued to use that expression. And my sense of it is that if someone were to come to him and take issue with talking about a civil war, he's going to continue to use that kind of language. The reason why is because, and I talk about this in my book, is that there is a tangible political benefit to him and to his supporters. It excites and revs up what is now a somewhat depressed base. And he's using this kind of rhetoric because he knows if he goes after CNN, if he goes after the press, if he goes after Elijah Cummings, if he goes after the squad and so on, there is a segment of his political base that is energized and revved up by that. We have to understand that. We can diagnose that. And smart, sophisticated people who follow politics can say, okay, well, that's what the president is doing when he's doing that. But it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of this discussion, and that is, obviously, there are people who don't get all of that, who don't understand that some of this is tactical, that some of this is strategic, and could be incited to do something that could really hurt people and lead to a course of events that we're all going to come to regret. And so this is a big concern of mine, and I didn't want to end on a heavy note, but we all have to, I think, heading into this next campaign, think deeply about, is this the kind of country that we want to have? I know there are older folks in the audience here, maybe a little bit older than myself, and I ask this of folks from time to time. Do you remember when we were growing up, how our parents and our grandparents would say, it's our responsibility to make sure that we hand off to the next generation a better country than the one we got? Does anybody really say that anymore? Do we say that anymore? I don't think we do. We've got to get back to asking ourselves that question and to demanding that of ourselves, that we're handing off to the next generation a better country than the one we got. And you can't. It's a factual thing. You can't hand off to the next generation of Americans a better country if it's acceptable for our leaders to be talking about civil war and our fellow Americans being the enemy of the people. That is in contrast to handing off to the next generation a better country. And I think that is, if I were to send all of you home with some homework here in this esteemed setting that I'm very grateful to be a part of, it is that. It is to think deeply about the kind of country that we've become. Are we proud of this? Is this who we are? And I think that is something that ultimately, and I think Trump supporter, pink resist t-shirt wearing anti-Trump activist, we all have that little voice inside of us, I think, telling us that this is not who we are. This is not the country that we want to be a part of. And the thing that we have to figure out moving forward is, how do we get back to that place? It has never been perfect in this country, as your family can attest to, no question about it. But I think presidents, and this I think applies to President Kennedy and it applies to our best presidents, our greatest presidents. It is the presidents who have appealed to our better angels, who have appealed to our desire, this innate desire of Americans to strive for that more perfect union. That has always defined American greatness, in my view, and it always will.
I can't think of a better way to wrap this up. I'm sorry, I wish we could get to all the questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Jim, I can't tell you how blessed I am for you to be a friend and a colleague and to have
right
known
back
you all
at
these
you.
years, and proud of you for doing your work, fighting for the freedom of the press, and keep at it. And we look forward to having you back soon to talk about your next book.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate it, guys. Thank you. Thank you all the way up there. I never looked up there, but thank you too. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.